Since the beginning of time, mankind has been practicing worshiping God. Even in the Garden of Eden, we see worship going on. We also read of many pagan peoples in the Old Testament. We read about them worshiping their false gods, sometimes in absolutely despicable ways even, but they were practicing some kind of act that they would call worship, even though their worship was varied in many ways, and like I said, sometimes just abominable in itself inherently. Today also, many people have a false idea of what worship really is. We talked a few weeks ago about some words that just trigger in our minds instantly something, so that we may not even be able to fully think enough to consider what that word actually means. Worship could probably be added to that list, the word worship. What does it mean to worship? Some people cheapen and really shame the concept of worship by calling virtually anything worship, literally. There are some who would say that doing almost anything can be worship to God. I've referenced in the past an article I found. I don't remember how I found it, but I saw it online that was, I don't remember the exact title. I think I do, but rather than the title, I'll just say that the purpose of that article was to give readers 6 different ways they could worship God while they're on vacation. And I think that was pretty much the name of the article, but that was the purpose. Here are 6 ways to worship while you're on vacation. And okay, that might sound, okay, good, that's a nice idea. The problem is, what it really was a way for you to feel like you've worshiped without having to go worship. Who wants to go to church when they're on vacation, right? So here are 6 ways that you can worship while you're on vacation. And I'll just give you two examples of those 6. One of them was creating something. Art, I don't know, a sculpture, some kind of arts and crafts, some kind of painting. That could be worship, a way to worship God, they said. Another one was going on a nature walk. Can be worship. So basically, if you want to worship God, just go on a little walk. And you can check the box, just like on your tax form or something like that. You can check the box, I've worshiped because I went on a walk. These are very blatant examples of how people have totally lost what worship really is, the concept of worship. What is worship actually? What they don't realize is that there is a divinely approved pattern of worship, and always has been. From the beginning, there has been a pattern of worship, a way that God has accepted, a way to worship which God accepts, and along with that, there is a way to worship that God will not accept. And it goes back to that idea of a pattern. In Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5, the Hebrews writer makes he cites a very important passage that just talks about this pattern. He says, in Hebrews 8:5, he says, "See to it that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you." Make everything. Now, this is what God said to Moses. Now, while the things under number 1 there varied by covenant, the principle here has never changed. Even before Moses, it is evident that there was a pattern in the way they were to worship. Even though we're not given the record of that pattern being given to them, we know it was there. The reason we know it was there is because when Cain and Abel went to worship, God accepted Abel's worship, but he didn't accept Cain's. He rejected it. And it may lead to the question of why? Why did God accept Abel's offering which is basically worship, as far as, to translate that into our kind of language today, but rejected Cain's. Well, there have been volumes upon volumes written about that question, but at the very fundamental level, the reason that God did not accept or rejected Cain's offering, his worship, is because it was not acceptable to God. Simple as that. It was unacceptable. It was obviously not according to the manner that God approved that offering to be given, that worship, while Abel's was. We can't say the specifics. We can't say it was because of his heart or anything like that. All we know is what we're told. There's another example, Nadab and Abihu. We are told in Leviticus chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, that they offered strange fire. They were appointed to participate and partake in a certain element of the Old Testament worship there, the Old Covenant worship. But on that occasion, in Leviticus 12, they offered strange fire, the old versions say. Some of the newer versions, instead of strange, it says unauthorized fire. That's what makes it strange. That's why it's strange. To us, the word strange means abnormal. It's weird almost. If something is strange, it's like that's not exact. Something's off. But in another sense of the word strange, like if you use it as an example, just to say that this man and woman's marriage has disintegrated and is now being has broken apart because the woman was going off with strange men. May not use it in that way anymore, but it once would have been used in that way. What's strange about them? They were weird? No, they were strange because they were something other than the man she was supposed to be with. That's what's strange. That's why they're strange men. They're not her man. Well, this fire was strange because it was not the fire that God commanded them to use or to make in the worship. So God struck them down right there on the spot as an example and as a lesson. It was unauthorized. It was not done according to the pattern that God had shown them. 400 years before Christ, God declared his total disgust with the worship of the Jews because they were giving animals as offerings that were not according to the pattern that God had set. They were offering lesser things, the blind and the lame and the useless and otherwise or sick and otherwise useless animals. So we see, if nothing else, that there is a right way and a wrong way to worship God. Before the law of Moses, during the law of Moses, but what about now? What about under the new covenant? Is it any different? Well, I would submit to you that just the very fact that there was a pattern under the before the Mosaic covenant, and there was a pattern under the Mosaic covenant, well, that would already lead to the assumption, it would stand to reason that there would certainly be a pattern under the new covenant, post-Moses Mosaic covenant. But what do we see? Well, first of all, we need to look at the concept of worship in the Bible. The word, what does worship? The word worship actually mean? In the Hebrew, not worship, the word pattern. The word pattern in the Hebrew that's used in that passage that's quoted in Hebrews 8:5 simply means a pattern, a plan, or a form. But in the New Covenant, there's a few different definitions that are very interesting. It means an impress, a print or a mark. It can mean the mark of a stroke or blow, an archetype serving as a model, type, or pattern. The word pattern, it's a model. It's a type. This is the way that it is to be done. Just like God said to Moses, make sure that you do everything according to the pattern. And again, that principle has never changed. When we see a pattern, we ought to accept that pattern. We ought to adopt that pattern. We ought to, as Moses was told to do, make everything according to that pattern. Where there is no pattern, then it's a little bit different. But where there is a pattern, we ought to acknowledge and respect that pattern. Now for the word worship. There are different aspects of worship, different words that for worship, different words that are translated worship, and they really cover different aspects of worship. For one, the first one is proskuneo, which means express an attitude or gesture one's complete dependence on or submission to a higher authority. But there are other words too. One is latreia, which is the service or worship of God. It's used in Romans 12:1. And etholothreskia is a very interesting word because in Colossians 2:23, it is translated will worship. Will worship. It means self-chosen worship or self-made religion, the ESV says. Self-chosen worship. One very old translation described that or defined that as voluntary worship, but in the sense of the kind of worship that men have chosen according to their own fantasy. Now, Paul mentions that in a condemning way. He says there are some who take part in will worship, self-made religion or self-made worship, worship that men have chosen according to their own fantasy. They've just made it up for themselves. It has nothing to do with any pattern. It has nothing to do with any divine instruction. It is simply worship that they have made for themselves. And he says, don't do that. Don't go along with these people who do this and that, and among those are self-chosen worship. Jesus also talked about how there is a concept of there is such a thing as vain worship. Whenever, among other things, whenever we change the worship of God, it's vain worship. That's one way to make it vain. Whenever it's not in my heart, there's another thing. Makes it vain. There is such a thing as vain worship. So I can worship God and that worship actually be totally vain, which means it's totally useless. It's not worship, really. It's actually something else besides worship. So the first two words for worship more or less include the idea of obedience, of acceptance in our worship, while the latter plainly indicates that there is such thing as sinful worship. There is a kind of worship that's wrong. So again, that leads to the question, what about the new covenant? That's what we're going to look at this morning for the next few minutes. What do we see in the New Testament about worship? Do we find a pattern? And again, if we do, then we ought to make note of that. Make note of it, of that pattern. Because as we've seen in this study over these last few weeks, as we've pointed out, the New Testament is the most important thing that we have as far as God's will and word, because there is no other document, there is no other word from any other human being that we can confirm as being from God. Period. And therefore, what the New Testament says is going to be the most important piece of information on that subject. So we've seen examples of Old Testament worship which clearly indicate that there was a right and wrong way. And as I've already said, it would be silly just to assume for no reason at all that the New Covenant is different in that way. But when we turn to the New Testament, what do we see? What we see is what is commonly referred to as the 5 acts. And I put acts in quotation marks because that's probably or absolutely most certainly not the best word to use to describe it, but that is generally what they are called. The 5 acts of worship. We see 5 different acts, if you will, 5 different ways, elements of the way that the New Testament church, Jesus' church, worshiped God under the New Covenant. So we could call this, as we call the lesson, the worship in the New Covenant, or we call it the New Testament pattern of divinely approved worship, because that's what we see when we turn. First of all, we see that they worship God in song. One of the things that the New Testament church did in worshiping God was singing. They sang together. We're going to see more on this in just a second. They sang songs. They sang hymns and psalms and spiritual songs. Secondly, they prayed. Part of their worship was praying. In 1 Timothy 2, Paul talked about how he gave further instructions on here's how we need the prayers to be done and led in the church. Talking about public prayer together. And they worship by teaching or preaching, whichever one you want to call it, the Word of God. Acts 2:42, Ephesians 4:11, we see that. But there's a little bit further that we learn. And as I just alluded to in 1 Timothy 2, these things were all led by faithful males in the New Testament church. That's what we read. Explicit instruction that men were to lead in these things. 1 Timothy 2:8 and following, among other places. Just as a little side note, the word sometimes, there are times in the Bible, depending on what translation you have, where the word men is a Greek word that really means people, because it's just the word for humanity or humankind. But that is not the word that Paul uses in 1 Timothy 2. He does not say people, that humans should lead in these prayers and other acts. He uses the word for males. And that is a very crucial point. Males are to lead in these things. That's all we ever see when we look to the New Testament, and that is what we explicitly see instructed when we turn to the New Testament, among other places that would indicate that same thing. But there are a couple others. Fourthly, we see that one of the ways that they worshiped God when they came together was by storing up, it's called in 1 Corinthians 16, giving. They gave of their means. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 2, we see it indicated that they did this every first day of the week. Get ahead of myself a little bit. Let me come back to that. And then there's communion, the fifth, communion. And when we look a little bit deeper into this, we see even the way what they used for this communion, this Lord's Supper. They used unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine. Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22. These latter two, as I just said, were done, according to the New Testament record, on the first day of the week only. Don't read of anything else. Now, just because we don't read of anything else doesn't necessarily mean they didn't do it on other days, if that was all that there was. However, in Acts 20, verse 7, there is pretty strong indication, as Luke is recording that situation, that they specifically waited until the first day of the week to observe that communion supper together. When we look deeper into the context of Acts 20 and what Luke is saying and the situation that's going on there, it pretty strongly indicates that they, for whatever reason, waited until the first day of the week came around to observe the Lord's Supper. That's something for us to consider. Why would they wait? Why did they wait when they seemingly had no other reason to wait? And they were, in addition to that, they were in a very stressful rush to get to Jerusalem with the money they were taking to the poor saints who were suffering very greatly there. Why'd they wait almost a whole week just to take the Lord's Supper? Well, to ask that question seems to me to answer that question. And then also we see that they did these last two every first day of the week. They did these things on the first day of the week and on no other day. And they did these two things every first day of the week. The Greek New Testament in 1 Corinthians 16 actually says, and every English translation should also say it, even though it doesn't always, says every first day of the week, or the first day of every week. Either one of those two would work. This is what we see the New Testament church doing, and this is what we're calling a pattern. We read of how they worshiped, when they worshiped, and any other specifics as to the manner in which they did these things, such as 1 Timothy 2, about men leading in the prayers, which would also obviously apply to the singing, and we also read where men were to take the lead in the teaching and preaching. Just the males. Notice some things that are missing from this list, like taking a walk or drawing a picture. I can tell you right now, if I drew a picture for worship, that God would not be glorified in that. Some people may do a great job, but it wouldn't be for me. But the point is, those are all just excuses. Those would all fall under the category of will worship. You're just trying to find a way to make yourself feel like you've worshiped without having to worship. It's a very interesting thing in Genesis 22, whenever Abraham is to take Isaac up on the mount. He tells the servant there, he says, "You stay here. I and the boy are going to go up and worship. And then we're going to come back." Okay, what does that mean? Well, if nothing else, it simply indicates that worship is a thing, a specific thing that you do at a specific time, at a specific place. He could have said, we're going to walk up the mountain in worship to God, and then we're going to walk back down as a little extra worship to God. No, we're going to go up to the top of the mountain and worship, and then when we're done, we're going to come back down. Because worship is a specific thing that you do at a specific time, at a specific place, with specific people. And that's what we see in the New Testament as well. There are specific things that fall under the category of worship. And these are the specific things that we see the New Testament church doing as worship. These 5 things. Well, that leads us then to this question. What about the musical worship of the New Testament? What about the musical side? Here's a principle we need to understand first. When the Bible speaks, it is not open to mitigation. It's not open. I don't have the ability or authority to change it, to say otherwise, to say something else. When it speaks. And likewise, when the Bible is silent, it's not open to liberation. There's no way to liberate ourselves, in other words, from whatever, or to give ourselves the liberty, rather, to do otherwise, or to do something that it is silent about, or relatively silent about, I should say. When the Bible speaks, mainly, that is a matter of authority. And accepting the authority of the Scriptures is paramount, according to all the information we have in the Bible as a whole. Accepting the authority of the Scriptures is paramount to being right with God. Because again, it's the only thing that we have that we know is from God. No matter what any other person says, I can't know if what they're saying is from God. So the Scriptures, when it speaks on any subject, that is the authoritative word on that subject. And there are 2 passages, 2 primary passages, and I would say pretty much just 2 passages, period, that discuss or directly mention the musical worship of the church, of the New Testament church. They are Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16. So if we are going to look to the New Testament to see anything about the way the church of Jesus worshiped musically, we're going to have to find it in those 2 passages, because they're the only ones that mention it. It doesn't mention it anywhere else. That's where the speaking and the silence comes in. I can't draw some conclusion from some other passage that goes against what is explicitly said in these passages that directly mention it. And I've put it in this form just to see how incredibly parallel they are. They're not identical, but they are almost as close as you can get without being identical. Here's what they say. Ephesians 5:19 says, "Speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord. It's talking about don't be drunk with wine, be filled with the Spirit, be drunk with the Spirit, singing and making or speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord. Colossians 3:16 says, teaching, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to God. I mean, perfectly parallel, if not identical. There's another important thing. Again, based on this principle, here's what the Bible says they did. This is the manner in which they were instructed to partake in the singing, the musical element of their worship. This, I should say, this may be the only place it discusses it in the New Testament, but there are other documents outside the Scriptures that also confirm that this is what the Christians in the first century did. They would sing hymns without instruments when they came together to worship God in the name of Jesus Christ, or even to Jesus Christ even. Documents, more than one document that says that about the early Christians. But these are the two passages. So since the Bible has explicitly indicated these things, this is where we don't have the authority to make it something else. Not because the New Testament doesn't speak on that, but because it does. This is the thing that many people do not understand. It's not an argument or a doctrine from silence. Because it's not silence, you see. You're drawing a document or a doctrine from silence because you're saying that the New Testament doesn't mention instruments and therefore it's wrong to have them. No, that's not right. That's not the argument. The argument is not that they're not there and therefore they can't be there. The argument is singing is there. That's not silence, because singing is explicitly mentioned. So it's not about the absence of any mention of the way they worshiped musically. It's about the fact that the way they did is there. Speaking one to another, the kind of songs that were sung, the way they were sung, just singing. By the way, the word translated making melody simply means to sing. It used to mean something else. In classical Greek, it didn't mean that in the first century, according to Greek scholars. It doesn't have anything to do with plucking the strings of a bow or an instrument or anything like that. It simply meant to sing. By the time the middle of the first century came around when these passages were written, that's what that Greek word meant. Just singing, without the accompaniment of any kind of instrument. This is the way the New Testament church worshiped musically. This is what the pattern suggests. And when there is a pattern, we ought to do things according to the pattern. So what does that exactly mean? Well, just looking a little bit in more detail, we have to understand that when we see a command from God, just to use an extreme example, when God says do this, it means don't do anything else. Period. They're exclusive in that way. Now somebody might say, okay, fair enough, but this isn't something that God said to do. God doesn't say, thou shalt do this, the way he said, thou shalt not kill. So it doesn't have anything to do with what God commands. Well, when we understand the authority of the Scriptures, it does. This is the pattern from the apostles by the authority of Jesus Christ, instructing his church how to do these things. And therefore, it may as well be a thus says the Lord, thou shalt do this. When we understand the authority of the Scriptures and the pattern and the importance. But we also understand that in everyday language, that makes perfect sense. Do this means don't do that. Don't you know that? We all know that. Let me give you an example. The simplest and shortest example I've been able to come up with. If I said, wash my car. 3 words, that's all it is. But there are so many implications to that, aren't there? So many specifics implied by that, those three words. Wash my car. For instance, when I say wash my car, you understand that I mean don't paint my car, don't scratch my car, don't drive my car, etc. Because I said wash my car. And you understand that when I say wash my car, I don't mean wash his car or wash her car or wash that person's car, because I said wash my car. You see how that works? And I mean don't wash my house or my shoes or my cat or anything else, because I said wash my car. Sometimes the argument that we hear is, well, the New Testament doesn't say don't do it. You're absolutely right, it doesn't. But it doesn't have to. Because we see the pattern of what to do. And when we read this, speaking to one another, that automatically means that there are some things not to do in our musical worship. When it says teaching and admonishing, then that would mean that there are some things that we're not to do in our musical worship. Practical things. Is this thing that we're doing teaching and admonishing, or is it doing something else? Are we speaking to one another? Psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Well, he didn't say don't sing your favorite country song, but he didn't have to, because we see what to sing. He didn't say don't use instruments. He didn't have to, because it says to sing, period. In your heart and to God. Not for personal acclaim and not for entertainment. It is a mutual and communal edification process as we worship, as we offer it up to God. And any other way would not be glorifying to God. It wouldn't be accepted by God no more than Cain's offering was accepted by God. It wouldn't be accepted by God any other than Nadab and Abihu's fire was accepted by God, because it isn't respecting the pattern. The pattern. The same principle that we use for the way we ought to behave in life should be the pattern, or the principle that we use in determining the way we ought to worship. There are things that I can do in my life that would not be pleasing to God. Correct? Sure. How do I know which ones? How do I know what to do to make sure that God is pleased? You look and see what He's pleased with. See what He commands to do. See what He expects us to do. See how He expects us to behave. See how He expects us to treat people. See how the Lord treated people, and so on and so forth. How did the apostles? How should I treat my brothers? What did the apostles say according to the authority of Jesus? What instructions do we have? And when we see those instructions and those patterns, that's the period at the end. That's it. And anything else is contrary to the pattern. See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you. It's not about silence. It's about the exact opposite. And worship. Why have we created a new category? Sure, it works that way about the way we treat people, but it doesn't work that way about the way we worship God. If there's anything, I don't know if there's anything that God has ever been more immediate and straightforward and undeniable about than how seriously He takes the worship of Him. You'll be hard-pressed to find another example of when God struck somebody down with fire because of something else they did. But He did do that whenever Nadab and Abihu offered unauthorized fire. Because it matters. This is what Jesus meant when He said, God wants true worshipers to worship Him. That worship in spirit and in truth. What does it mean to worship God in spirit and in truth? Well, some people say, well, it means to worship God in spirit means you do it from the heart. And to worship God in truth means you're truly doing it from the heart. Well, that just doesn't even make sense. So what he said is worship God from the heart and from the heart. Spirit means from the heart, and in truth means sincerely. Again, that's the same thing. To worship God in spirit obviously would mean that's the easy one. Sure, it would mean from the heart. It's from the Spirit. It's in the Spirit. It's from within. And to worship God in truth would mean according to the truth. To worship God in spirit means according to the Spirit. Worship God in truth means according to the truth. Sometimes we fail to worship God in spirit because our minds are somewhere else, because all we're thinking about is when it's going to be over, because we're worried about where we're going to go for lunch, or so many other things. Because we stayed up till 2 in the morning and we can barely stay awake. But most people misunderstand the concept of worshiping God in truth. God, the Father, is seeking such persons to worship Him, Jesus said. Those that worship Him in spirit and in truth, according to the pattern that we see. Really, it all comes, if we boiled it down to it, it would really, the reasoning is like this. We see how they did it. Why would we want to do it any different? Forget the question of, is it allowed? Why would we? Since we see how Jesus' church did it, why would we do it any different? What's the point? What's the purpose? Really, it seems there's only one purpose. Because I want to. That's it. I don't want to do it like that. And when you look at it that way, it pretty much condemns itself. Who cares what I want? I'm not here to worship me. I'm not here to entertain me. I'm not here to make me feel happy or good or whatever else, to fill my cup, whatever it is. We should be here to worship and glorify God. And we have to understand that whenever we worship in a way that He has not authorized, we're not glorifying God. No matter how much we feel like we are, we're not. God has never been glorified by something that is contrary to the pattern that He has set. So if I'm worshiping in a way that is not glorifying to Him, then what am I doing? It's not worship at all. To bow down, to prostrate before. Those are symbolic words that depict that the act of us worshiping is doing that. And submission to Him is built into every one of those things. That's why we do things the way we do them. It's not because of some headquarters of the Church of Christ that dictates this is the way that it's to be done. It's because it's the way they did it. That's it. That's as simple as it is. And as we looked at last week, whatever the way they did things was and taught is the way every single person who claims to be a Christian should do it. Because that's part of continuing steadfastly in the apostles' teaching.